I hark back to the aftermath of the treaty with reluctance and distaste, for the memory is painful, and a country so bitterly divided, nearly half and half, on so vital an issue, presents a sorry spectacle. The next generation took the measure of the shortcomings of the two parties for and against the treaty, and perhaps the most disturbing feature in Irish life during the past 30 years has been the detachment of the bulk of the younger people from public affairs. I attribute that stolid indifference largely to disgust at the rancor permeating our public life for many years after the treaty. The resort of the bellicose Republicans to civil war was inexcusable, but the personal acrimony that infected several of the leaders on both sides was of more lasting effect. There was nothing of that spirit in Michael Collins, who understood his opponents and sympathized. A majority accepted the treaty because the strain was becoming intolerable, but a distinct reason for accepting it was stressed by Arthur Griffith with the delegates in London. He anticipated that if Lloyd George did not wage immediate and terrible war upon the rejection of his proffered terms, he would appeal over our heads to the country with an offer of Dominion Home Rule on similar lines, whereupon the reception of that settlement was likely to expose the weakness of the really national elements, and perhaps to reveal an insistent yearning for peace. That, I think, is at the next stage of Anglo-Irish diplomatics the key to his very firm resolve not to break with Lloyd George on the new Irish constitution. The provisional government had promised to publish its draft constitution before the general election of June 1922, but the belated appearance of the draft in the press on the morning of the election, too late to be studied or even to be seen by many electors, was a shock to men of goodwill. The voters were clearly entitled to know the constitution to be proposed for their acceptance. That delayed draft was the outcome of a singular display of weakness on our side, when the document was taken to London for submission to Lloyd George. He should not have been consulted at all upon our constitution, but Griffith had, I think, personally promised to show him the draft before its publication. That draft of the constitution represented the conscientious labors of a very competent advisory committee of our own, on whose judgment the Irish government could and should have relied to stand firm against any material concession to British susceptibilities. The committee's draft, carefully thought out to comply with the actual exigencies of the treaty, deliberately omitted both king and oath, if I accept a single mention of the king in connection with the Governor-General, who was to be simply a figurehead. Lloyd George perused the draft and deferred seeing the delegates from Dublin for an inordinate time. When he did see them, he was, or affected to be, furious at those omissions, whereupon Arthur Griffith at once gave way, though Hugh Kennedy, who attended as Attorney General, was a lawyer of a stature to confront any British jurist. And then the surrender was promptly endorsed by the government at home. That, I think, was a grave mistake. Griffith and the government, with their own adviser at their back, could have declared that if Lloyd George persisted in his truculent objections, they would resign office, though it was hard for supporters of the treaty to admit that Republican prognostications had shown considerable foresight. Lloyd George must then have faced the prospect of the only possible alternative government, with Eamon de Valera at its head. I am convinced that no British government could, in the temper of those days, have contemplated bringing into office an Irish Republican government, while to denounce the much vaunted Anglo-Irish Treaty of Peace would have been too humiliating a solution. I was Minister for Foreign Affairs in the Doyle government and resigned at this juncture, but at Griffith's request I agreed to stay until the meeting of Dáil Éireann a few days later. It was fixed for the first day of July. However, the civil war broke out in the interval. The atmosphere of the year 1922 is not easy to recapture in the year 1951. Most men of position, of course, stood cautiously aloof, while the press was blatantly one-sided. National public opinion generally took a childlike view of politics. It saw the country sharply rent by the treaty into two fields of thought, the one pure white and the other a murky black. But the initial difficulty for many good men was to determine which was which. Once you felt that you had discovered which really was the field of white, you enrolled as a white and proceeded to champion your side through thick and thin. Apart from the labor men, for whom even ardent partisans would make allowances, if you were not wholeheartedly with the white or the black, you were generally put down as a tiger or a heave, or a crank, or a factionist. The pro-treaty government had to negotiate a modus vivendi with the Republicans. It had to deal with the British government on the constitutional issues, and it had to present the Irish people with the very best constitution that the circumstances allowed. Manifestly, we needed a government of outstanding capacity, but the pro-treaty party was ill-equipped for those delicate tasks, and the leaders, in their search for all available talent, felt constrained to blend the national element in the government after the treaty with youthful strains drawn from a less robust tradition. The pro-treaty party contained many men of proved character and courage, but very few qualified by education or training to take any part in constitutional controversies. Hence, the really amazing docility of the party as a whole. In fact, the party was utterly perplexed by the problems of statecraft. Only a few months before the Constitution appeared, the majority, easily swayed by propaganda, had been induced to believe that document number 2, so thoroughly vindicated by later developments, was a verbal quibble and nothing more. The Labour Party distinguished itself by the high quality of its leadership, but outside that group, only a handful of men made any serious contribution to the debates. When the draft Constitution, amended at Lloyd George's behest, came clause by clause to be discussed, the government, secured in the solid caucus behind it, refused to place before Dáil Éireann the text of the draft shown to Lloyd George, because the extent of its unhappy submission must then have stood revealed in the light of the considered opinion of our own advisory committee. 2 excellent minority drafts emanating from the committee were likewise kept secret. I do not believe that the government would have attempted to arrest its political opponents attending Dáil Éireann as deputies. The country, bewildered as it was, would have resented any such abuse of power against non-combatants. As things stood in 1922, I consider the abstention of the Republican deputies, other than soldiers, during the protracted debates on the Constitution to have been a blunder, not to say a disaster, because their presence in Leinster House would have put heart into certain deputies whose loyalty to the government was at times strained to near breaking point, and because their presence would in all probability have resulted in a much improved Constitution, and because their presence would have ensured the precious personal contacts necessary to bring the Civil War to a speedy end.